Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today's call is focused on the January employment situation. And Ryan Gedney, our senior economist, is going to take over and give us a presentation, and then we'll take questions after that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Jessica. I'll just jump in here. The data we'll discuss today are based in part on estimates from two surveys, statistics like the unemployment rate, labor force, total employment, and the number of unemployed are derived from a survey of households, otherwise known as the current population survey. Simply put, the household survey is meant to capture the employment and labor force status of individuals within Colorado during a given period. The household survey also includes the self-employed, independent contractors, farm workers, and those not attached to a traditional payroll employer. Non-farm payroll jobs estimates from a survey of business establishments and government agencies are intended to measure the number of jobs, not the number of people employed. These estimates exclude employees in agriculture, private households, and the self-employed. As we noted in today's press release, the reference period for the establishment and household surveys was the pay period or week that includes the 12th of the month. Therefore, these data provide a snapshot of Colorado's employment situation as the state was experiencing a decline in COVID-19 cases, which resulted in a loosening of business restrictions the week prior. Again, we're talking about the month of January. Revisions to January data, along with preliminary estimates for February, will be released in under 2 weeks on Friday, March 26th, and we'll have another press call that day as well. The employment situation release schedule will go back to normal in April when we report on preliminary estimates for March. As we mentioned in multiple spots in today's press release, all household and establishment data for prior years have been revised in our annual benchmarking process. This means that the estimates we reported last year, like the unemployment rate and the payroll jobs lost or added over a month, have been replaced with new estimates. Tables in the press release refer to those changes. Starting with the results from the household survey, Colorado's seasonally adjusted unemployment rate decreased in January to 6.6%. That's a decline of 0.3 of a percentage point from the revised December unemployment rate of 6.9%. After benchmark revisions, Colorado's unemployment rate was fixed at 6.9% between October and December. Additionally, the peak unemployment rate in April was revised slightly downward from 12.2% to 12.1%. In January, Colorado had the 35th lowest unemployment rate in the nation. That's tied with Alaska. South Dakota and Utah had the lowest rates at 3.1%, and Hawaii had the highest rate at 10.2%. The U.S. seasonally adjusted unemployment rate decreased from 6.7% in December to 6.3% in January. On an annual average, Colorado's unemployment rate was 7.3% in 2020, which ranked 25th in the nation. For context, Colorado's annual unemployment rate in 2010, which was 9.2% at the height of the Great Recession, that ranked 30th nationally, while the state's annual rate in 2003, at the height of the early 2000s recession, ranked 35th. So relatively speaking, Colorado's unemployment rate rank in 2020 is actually better than the past two recessions. The U.S. annual unemployment rate last year was 8.1%. Colorado's labor force participation rate fell from 68.8% in 2019 to 67.7% in 2020. However, that rate of 67.7% ranked as the sixth highest in the U.S. last year. For comparison, the national labor force participation rate in 2020 was 61.8%. And as always, we'll send out talking points since my talking points contain a lot of data points. Additionally, Colorado's share of the 16-plus population employed in 2020 fell to 62.8% from 66.9% in 2019. That rate of 62.8% ranked as the ninth highest in the nation last year. For comparison, the U.S. employment to population ratio in 2020 was 56.8%. As we mentioned in today's press release, the counties with the highest not seasonally adjusted unemployment rates in January were Huerfano, Pueblo, Gilpin, Fremont, Los Animas, and Mesa. Among the 7 metropolitan areas in the state, Pueblo had the highest not seasonally adjusted unemployment rate at 9.3%. Boulder and Fort Collins had the lowest rates at 5.9 and 6.3% respectively, while Denver, Greeley, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction all had rates between 7 and 7.9%. It is recommended to compare all these sub-state rates I mentioned to the statewide not seasonally adjusted unemployment rate, which was 6.9% in January. The counties with the largest percentage point increase in their unemployment rates in January 2021 compared to January 2020 are as follows: Gilpin, Pueblo, Bent, Clear Creek, Denver, and La Plata. However, please keep in mind that the county level unemployment rates, these are still subject to further benchmark revisions through April 16th, which will coincide with our release of preliminary March data. So again, these data are subject to change going back to 2020 and prior. Now for the results from the establishment survey. The preliminary estimates show that on a seasonally adjusted basis, Colorado non-farm payroll jobs increased by 32,000 from December to January. This represents the largest over the month change for total non-farm jobs since June. The gain of 32,000 in January also wipes out the combined loss of 25,000 jobs in November and December. Along with estimates from the household survey, last year's establishment survey estimates have also been revised in the annual benchmarking process. The revised figures show that Colorado lost a total of 375,800 non-farm payroll jobs in March and April, instead of the previously reported total loss of 342,300. Including the new January numbers and revised figures from May to December, Colorado has regained 215,500 of the 375,800 non-farm payroll jobs lost in March and April. The total job gains of 215,500 from May to January represent a recovery of about 57% of those jobs lost earlier in the year, which ranks as the 30th fastest rate of recovery in the nation during that period. A similar analysis of the change in U.S. non-farm payroll jobs since April revealed the U.S. has added back close to 56% of lost jobs. So generally speaking, when you talk about the unemployment rate and recovery non-farm payroll jobs, Colorado is trending pretty similar to the U.S. In January, leisure and hospitality was the primary driver of job gains, with an over-the-month increase of 21,200, or about 2/3 of the total for all industries. Those gains are most likely due to lowering COVID-19 cases and the loosening of business restrictions in early January, with restaurants being the primary beneficiaries. Few other sectors had sizable gains in January, and no industry experienced significant losses. Professional and business services added 4,200 payroll jobs, while financial activities and trade, transportation, and utilities gained over 1,000. In what is hopefully a reversal from last year, government payroll grew by 3,600 in January. From February to December, government shed 21,100 jobs, and most of those were concentrated within either state or local educational services. With the newly benchmarked payroll numbers for 2020, we can have a better sense of understanding how each of the 18 industry sectors have recovered from losses experienced at the beginning of the pandemic. 4 industry sectors have gained back all the jobs lost early last year. That includes finance and insurance, transportation, warehousing and utilities, management of companies, and retail trade. 7 other sectors have regained more than 50% of jobs lost, and that does include accommodation and food services. And think hotels and restaurants. 4 industries have gained back jobs, but at a much lower rate than the 57% recovery rate for the state. That includes construction, arts, entertainment, and recreation, manufacturing, and private educational services. And finally, 3 industries have continued losses since April. Information, which includes movie theaters, mining and logging, which is dominated by oil and gas, and the aforementioned government sector. We did include a series of charts within our packet of our press release packets. And so you could also see those industry recovery rates in beautiful graphical form if you so choose to look at that. From May to January, private businesses have added 226,600 payroll jobs compared to the revised losses of 362,200 in March and April. So that represents a recovery of about 63% of private sector jobs lost earlier in the year, which outpaces the US rate of around 60%. Colorado's private sector job recovery rate ranks as the 26th fastest in the nation when expressed as a rate, and the 19th highest in absolute terms, meaning adding back 226,600 jobs. And finally, I want to touch on recovery rates for substate Colorado, specifically the 7 metropolitan statistical areas, or MSA, and the remaining residual of the state that is not in an MSA. Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, and Grand Junction have the fastest job recovery rates through January of the 7 MSAs. Colorado Springs was 69%, Fort Collins 67%, and Grand Junction 65%. Denver and Pueblo have recovery rates similar to that of the state. Denver at 55% and Pueblo at 54%. While the recovery rates for Boulder and Greeley substantially lag the rest of the state. Boulder's recovery rate is at 39%. That's primarily being driven by the disruption to the education sector in Boulder. And Greeley is the ties to oil and gas and industries that are tied to that industry as well. Now, while I've mentioned before that we do not break out non-farm payroll jobs by county, we can, however, look at the recovery rate for the residual of the state that is not an MSA. So we're essentially aggregating to what we can define as 47 non-metro counties. Those areas shed a combined total of 59,300 payroll jobs in early 2020, but have since regained back 39,900, or 67% of those lost jobs. So that recovery rate of 67% for non-metro Colorado well outpaces the state recovery rate of 57%. With that, I'm going to kick it back to Jessica and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, I think we can open it up for questions. Wayne has got one for Greeley. What is Greeley's recovery rate?
So Boulder's was 39%, Greeley is 28%. And that's also included in the packet of charts that comes with the press release. But yeah, that's what that is. So Dan, Ryan, looks like about half of the job losses recorded over 2020 is in leisure and hospitality. Do you have much info about how much the number of establishments in that sector fell due to closure or non-response? Dan, I don't know offhand. If you want to email me your question, that would be great. And I think our team could kind of think through an answer to that. Just offhand, just don't have anything ready for you. Ed, could you explain the major revision in December unemployment rate? So a couple things are driving this. One, just recall that these estimates were sample-based and they are subject to margin of statistical error. A couple things occurred that could explain the downward revision or the revision in general. First, many states actually had a large revision in their December unemployment rates. It was close to 20 states had an upward or downward revision of at least 0.7% in December. Through our annual benchmarking process, many years you'll see some revisions. Granted, the December one was relatively large, but We did have changes to our seasonal adjustment factors. New employment estimates are available through benchmarking, so that can change how we're estimating either employment or labor force estimates. Now, there's also the incorporation of new population controls from the US Census Bureau. And while we note this a couple times in the technical notes in the press release, there's also a change to the methodology and the model for estimating state level labor force data like the unemployment rate, total employment, labor force. And so that has an effect too. Question is, have you noticed any trends in employment data specific to mountain and resort towns and communities? Have they recovered more quickly or slowly than you expected? Have they recovered better or worse than other parts of the state? So as I mentioned before, with the current employment statistics program, we don't have breakouts for different parts of rural Colorado, say the rural resort area versus the Eastern Plains. And so what we do is we look at them I can look at it as a residual of the state. As I mentioned, the recovery rate for rural or non-metro Colorado is faster than Colorado, than the state as a whole. And I certainly believe that counties like Summit, Eagle, Pitkin are driving that. But it is difficult to really dig down into that because the data we have that I can drill down is lagged by a couple quarters, and so we'll take a little bit of time to really gauge, how much more quickly the mountain areas have recovered than other parts of the state. But generally speaking, non-metro Colorado has recovered quicker than the rest of the state. From Blair, the information sector not recovering as quickly still makes, hold on, sorry, it's bumping up here. The information sector not recovering as quickly still makes some sense, but any thoughts on why mining and logging and government sector not seeing the same recovery rates as other sectors? Right, so yeah, mining and logging, again, dominated by oil and gas. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw oil prices crater to levels we hadn't seen in quite some time. And so that does have an impact on employment levels. And so I think we're finally around September seeing those losses start to balance out for mining and logging. But from April to at least mid-fall, oil and gas continue to shed jobs. In terms of government, like I mentioned, that's primarily due to the disruption of the school year. Again, think of like support workers who would typically be for in-person learning, but when you have remote learning, that disrupts school bus drivers, janitors, lunch workers. It's pretty expansive. And then also for school, if you think of for universities, some universities depend a lot on student workers that are captured within some of our data. And so when you don't have in-person learning, that's also impacted as well. So I'm hopeful that that's a temporary, pandemic specific trend that we see, and that it kind of works itself out later this year, especially in the fall when hopefully everyone will be vaccinated and returning back to normal for the school years. Okay. Did the UI claims data adjusted for fraud corroborate what you saw in December and January in the employment situation? Yeah, although I mean the claims levels were relatively steady in both those months, with a slight decline. We have seen steadily declining claims activity for regular UI. So it does line up pretty well with what we are seeing in the December and January employment situation. I will mention though that the household survey, the sample size is a lot smaller than the establishment survey. So when I'm looking at kind of the robustness of a certain trend, I certainly will lean on the current employment statistics program more than say the unemployment rate data, just because the sample size is that much larger. But generally speaking, we're seeing improvements from both series, and we hope to see that through the rest of this first half of this year. February and March particularly. Tamara asks, you mentioned that the retail sector has regained all of the lost jobs. Does this include part-time workers, employees like Amazon? Do you have a sense on whether the small non-chain retailers or mostly the large national ones? So retail is an interesting situation. It's kind of a bifurcated recovery here with retail. First, I will mention that when we talk retail specifically, that does not include company like Amazon warehouses. Those will be coded within transportation, warehousing, and utilities. So that will be part of the greater trade, transportation, and utilities super sector, but will not be included in our retail sector data, just to make that clear. Where we're really seeing the gains in retail are pandemic related. We're seeing a lot of grocery stores, so food and beverage, general warehousing. So think about your large supermarkets, your large stores, a lot of like home repair stores. So think big box stores here. Where we're not seeing as much recovery is in places like, say, clothing stores. Places like that are still lagging in recovery. So I think that's certainly something we want to watch, is how do these other parts of the retail sector that may not have seen the same kind of boom that grocery stores. Again, a lot of people working from home, or not going out because restaurants are closed, so they're cooking more. I know we are, or at our house we're cooking a lot more than we certainly ever did, and so I imagine a lot of people are doing the same thing. So it'll be interesting to see how those trends play out over the next year. Wayne, does Ryan expect the unemployment rate to continue to drop as more people are vaccinated? Yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to expect Colorado to follow the U.S. trend in a declining unemployment rate. We saw that the U.S. rates declined in February when they announced those numbers earlier this month. So I do expect a gradual decline in the unemployment rate in the springtime. And then as we move to summer, we get better weather, further rate of vaccinations, I expect hopefully recovery to accelerate. Okay, Matt, any thoughts on why Fort Collins, Colorado Springs had the strongest job recovery rates? At this point, I don't. These are just surface level analysis at this point. I'm happy to look into that, Matt, and get back to you on your question. But at this point, it could be industry mix. There could be a lot of things that could explain those strong recovery rates. But yeah, unfortunately, I'll have to get back to you on that.
Ryan, here in Colorado Springs, a lot of that's due to professional and business services, which includes most of the defense contractors.
Yeah, so
and they haven't been much affected.
Right. So when we look at professional and technical services, that recovery rate was around 73%. Some of it also depends on like what's the concentration of restaurants. So Denver has a very high concentration of restaurants compared to many of the metropolitan areas in the state. And so that's one reason why Denver has a lower recovery rate. But yeah, to Wayne's point, I think industry mix certainly plays a huge part. Demographics may also play a part. There's a ton of reasons why one area could have better recovery than the other. Again, Grand Junction was also 65%. But yeah, Matt, I could certainly get back to you on that if you would like. Aldo, I thought we had some of the strongest manufacturing gains in the U.S. Did something change on revision? Yes. Or sorry, that was Charles. Or was it Aldo? No, it was Aldo. Yeah, so there's a couple of sectors that we saw rather large revisions. And although I don't know if you're paying attention to our expected revision series anymore, but using the quarterly census of employment and wages data, we did expect large revisions within manufacturing. It happens sometimes, but just the establishment survey, the sample, it just really missed on manufacturing growth. It had manufacturing growing basically at a fast, recovering all jobs lost. and that was not the case. So we did see strong downward revisions in manufacturing. Professional and technical services also saw a rather large downward revision, as well as private education sector. Charles, along with Matt's question, how can Grand Junction have one of the highest unemployment rates and one of the highest recovery rates? Grand Junction typically does have a relatively high unemployment rate regardless, Charles. And again, that's something I'll have to look into in terms of that disconnect. But just again, remember, sometimes the household and establishment surveys will show different trends, but just remember that they're both being benchmarked to the quarterly census of employment and wages data. So I do feel pretty good about these trends in January, rather than, say, if we were talking about this in November, December, when the data was still yet to be benchmarked. So Grand Junction does have a kind of difficult story to tell in terms of high unemployment rate and then a high recovery rate as well. So I just went through a ton of questions, but let me know if y'all need some. Okay, we have another one. Great. We have a couple more. Okay. All right. So Aldo, what are the trends in part-time, wanting full-time, and discouraged workers in general? So hold on, my other computer wanted to fall asleep during this. But generally speaking, the involuntary part-time rate generally let me think about this. Slightly declined in January. It's a little above 5% now of the total labor force or involuntary part-time. And that's coming down from a high of around 6% in November and December. How many people dropped out of the workforce last year? I don't have that exact number for you right now, Aldo, but as we documented in the press release packet, we do have some labor force participation rate numbers. What's really encouraging is that Colorado's labor force participation rate is nearly at the level it was pre-pandemic. And as I mentioned, I believe Colorado ranks something like ninth highest? Just a second. Sixth highest labor force participation rate in the nation in 2020. So while, it declined like everybody else's, Colorado still has a very high labor force participation rate. And so when you kind of look at it overall lens, I think it's really encouraging to see the labor force participation rate for Colorado come up to nearly what it was a year ago. Tamara, what are you seeing with jobs returning for gig workers or those on PUA? Unfortunately, again, we don't really have breakouts for that at the state level. I know the national data shows kind of those self-employed breakouts, but again, at the state level, we don't have those. And remember, those individuals are also not covered under unemployment insurance traditionally, so those aren't captured in our series like the quarterly census of employment and wages. So for the self-employed, I can't really give a good answer in terms of like, what does that look like? I could tell you there's still a lot of people on PUA. Phil, do you happen to know offhand how many people might be requesting PUA right now? I think it's in the high 70,000s or something like that.
I think it's in that high 70,000, as you've mentioned at this point in time.
Yeah, so there's obviously still demand for PUA benefits, but to know like what that overall picture looks like, unfortunately, is definitely hazy at the state level. All right, I think I got through them all for now, so I'm going to kick it back to Jessica. But again, happy to answer more questions if we have any.
Sure. So since we have a lull in questions for Ryan, I'm going to toss it over to Phil. He can update us on the rollout of the Great American Rescue Plan and any progress there. Phil?
Sure. And good morning, all. Thank you for joining us. So over the weekend, starting Friday night, we took the system down from 7 p.m. until 3 a.m. on Saturday. And beginning at 3 a.m., individuals were able to go back in and see additional funds placed on their claims, and on Sunday make their payment requests. on claims to receive payments under the American Rescue Plan. So a successful rollout of that plan to avoid gaps for individuals. As some individuals learned over the weekend, claims, we had several claims last year at the beginning of the pandemic filed effective March 15th of 2020. Therefore, those claims were actually expiring their benefit year on March 13th of 2021. So there was an additional step for those individual claimants. They were required to file their brand new state unemployment insurance claim first before the link would be available for them to reopen their PEUC claim. This is important to remember because this will be ongoing for a number of weeks now. And for the week ending April 3rd of 2021, that will be our largest single group of individuals who will be required to file a state unemployment insurance claim again before they can go back on their PEUC. And that is because last year we had about 104,000 claims filed during that week of claims that were effective April 5th. Individuals are able to remain on PEUC even if they meet that double dip requirement to be collecting off of the new state claim, so long as the weekly benefit amount on their brand new state claim is $25 or greater less than the weekly benefit amount they were receiving on PEUC. Based off of some numbers that we had run ahead of time, it's anticipated there would only be about 1,000 claimants where their weekly benefit amount would be greater on a brand new claim than on the prior claim. So the majority of claimants will continue on with their PEUC at this point in time. I wanted to issue a quick correction off of our press call from last week. If you recall, last week initially indicated did not believe that the mixed earners unemployment compensation had been extended. However, thank you to a follow-up question from Mr. Andy Kinney. Did a little more digging back into the American Rescue Plan, and the MEUC program has also been extended until September 6th of 2021, and programming will continue on that as we move forward. Again, a quick reminder there, we believe that that is less than 2,000 individual claimants that will ultimately be able to qualify to participate in that program and receive that additional $100 each week because they will have been able to establish that they had $5,000 in net income from their gig employment. Another reminder too, just as we continue to go on, that KUSA claimants at every quarter change are required to file a brand new state unemployment insurance claim just to ensure that they are not at that point in time monetarily eligible for state benefits. If they are monetarily eligible for state benefits, then in general, they would have to file that claim at that point in time. And other than that, that is all I have is updates.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, we will sign off for today and talk to you guys later. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Bye.